Hello and welcome to the Revenue Leadership Podcast by Topline. I'm your host, Kyle Norton, CRO at owner.com. And every Wednesday, we dive deep into the strategies and tactics being used to drive success by the best revenue leaders in the world. So join me as I sit down with revenue operators to discuss actionable frameworks that you can implement in your business today with no fluff, no sales pitches, and no platitudes.
This episode is brought to you by SalesApe.ai. SalesApe is the AI-powered sales assistant that engages your inbound leads instantly, answers questions, and books sales meetings without you needing to hire extra staff. Built for any company with more than 100 leads a month, SalesApe ensures no leads slip through the cracks. More sales meetings, more deals, less hassle. Grow without the overhead. Try SalesApe for free at salesape.ai/Kyle.
Today's guest is John Eitel, who's had an epic career across Rackspace, WP Engine, Canva, and most recently Demandbase, where he was CRO. Most notably, under John's leadership at Canva, the company grew from under 400 people to over 3,000 people, where he built the upmarket sales CS motions. He ran the American region, built a big office in Austin, and obviously Canva has gone on to massive success on the back of the foundation John has built. So we are going to talk PLG plus SLG, how to layer a sales-led growth motion on top of product-led foundations. And we're also going to talk career navigation. So John's picked pretty well and is currently in the process of picking his next thing. And so I'm really keen to hear how John thinks about selecting the right fit, the right company, how to validate, and what it means to be a CRO today and how that might be different. So lots of good stuff to unpack. So excited to get into this one. Thanks for joining, John.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Excited to dig in as well.
So I gave a snippet of your background, but what's the 60-second highlight reel that I might have missed?
Yeah, I'd say a career builder of startups. I got the chance to do it early in my career and spent 13 years building one from a small team with a dream to publicly traded company, and it really shaped who I am and really set me on this path. And I would say ever since that first one, I've been working with companies that are going through what I call the awkward adolescence phase or the messy middle of growth, and helping them think about how they're going to make that next move, how they're going to transition to a professional organization with repeatability and scale, thinking about new markets and expanding, kind of into new regions or bringing new products to market. That tends to be my, my jam and probably the thing that I gravitate to the most. I would say I've done a lot of different contexts. As you mentioned, I've done, hardware sales, software sales. I've done PLG. I've done social media networks. I've done a lot of different, I would say, unique contexts, for sales. And I think that's been, purposeful on my part. It's probably one of the more eclectic backgrounds that you see for folks like me. But I think it's given me a lot of tools that I'm able to employ at different times, as we go through these different shifts. And as, buying behavior continues to change, it allows you to think about, things from consumer that now may work in the enterprise, and how to bring things like PLG into your motion when you want to build some efficiency there as well. It really, allows you a lot of, tools to draw on there.
Nice. I've had a similarly eclectic career: enterprise, market research, selling into HR, then Shopify, which, was SMB all the way through to enterprise. And now I'm in pure SMB. And I love the book Range by David Epstein. And why generalists rule the world, in his words. And so it's something I often point to, because you build this diversity of mental model. There you go. I figured that would have been in your library somewhere.
It's on the stack, and yes, absolutely. Your background and your journey is something that's so helpful, but I think a lot of folks don't necessarily think about it that way.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to get into building SLG. And so WP Engine, for those who don't know, that's WordPress is an open source platform. And so WP Engine is the company that takes WordPress to market, to commercialize it, correct?
Yep. Yeah. It's one of the largest, now become one of the largest players in the ecosystem, but, started out as, WordPress was having, high levels of adoption. Everybody was starting to choose it as the de facto kind of CMS platform. And what we were starting to see is people were taking it into large businesses, mid-market companies. And so if you were doing it, you wanted to do it with a company like WordPress Engine, because you got the ability to have access to experts, SLAs, highly secure, robust platforms that had, things like redundancy and scaling built into it there. So it was a way to take, an early idea, if you were using WordPress, and transition it into a really robust infrastructure there.
Nice. And so that was predominantly PLG before you got there. This was the first time that you had done this big SLG layering on top of PLG. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly it, where I first kind of got some exposure to it.
Okay. What a place for it. So I'm curious, I want to start pretty high level, and then we're going to drill way down. I'm curious how you think about the playbook. I'm careful about the word playbook, but the patterns that you find are present for companies building a PLG motion or building an SLG motion on top of product-led foundations. What are the key building blocks? What are the things you have to get right? And then I want to sort of unpack the earliest days of it, and then taking it to maturity. But let's just start with the core building blocks in your mind.
Yeah, no, good question, Kyle. And I think that's what I often get, like when to introduce it, right? And what's the right time. And I think with that one in Canva, which we'll talk a little bit about too, like it starts with, kind of early signals and kind of trends and buying behavior. So you need to start to see, some of these patterns emerging. And so for WP Engine, and, as an example, when I joined, it was probably, I think 7-8% of the internet was using WordPress. Now it's upwards of 25 to 30%. But at the time it was, lots of content. It was the mommy bloggers and the pet blogs, is what I kiddingly said at the time. So not really mission critical B2B yet. But we started to spot this trend, and that was really where I came into the mix here. Where we started to see folks who were using it in their day to day, and they started to bring it to work in like certain instances. So people at big companies like Patagonia was an early one for us there, where, they had signed up, with our PLG motion, and we were like, gosh, we're actually running a really, important part of their infrastructure, later there, .com. So that was a ton of fun to see. But as we went and interviewed, the person who made that buying decision, it was a marketer who had used it in their, in their personal life, or maybe in a small business context. And then they move into a big company, and they find out that they can't get, the help they need. They're not able to do the things that they want to do. And so they were gravitating to WordPress because it was familiar, and they were, starting to use it for some of these things. And so, seeing these patterns emerge was really like the first tipping point for us, of like, there might be some there. And we went out and interviewed them, and just basically just talked to them about like why they made that decision. Because we had about, at the time, about 25, 30 of them, that had kind of come through just the natural organic channel of PLG. And we want to understand who they were, what's their profile, and could we go out and find more of those folks? And like, what were the challenges, that they were already starting to see? And then even through the conversations, I was doing these with our, chief product officer at the time. It was like, what are the things that they haven't seen yet that we know they're going to hit, right? Some scale challenges. And so, it was a lot of, kind of really taking some early learnings and some of these like, beginnings of, kind of interest and people starting to use the platform, and then thinking about, okay, how do we commercialize it? How do we put a product offering together around this? And then, what is our, plan in motion to sell it and go out and acquire more of these? And so that was, kind of what led to probably the beginnings, and the, kind of the playbook. I hate that word as well,
Yeah.
That, kind of got us going, in that direction there.
So those first two phases are really like validation. Is there something here? Customer interviews makes a ton of sense there. I'm sure a bunch of data and analysis was involved. And then thinking about packaging, and is this sort of step two also where you start figuring out the product requirements for the market? Yeah.
Totally. That's what those interviews are driving, is really, what is, kind of the immediate needs and product requirements. And then, taking them through also, like, when this continues to scale and they bring more things into the mix, or when they add more complexity, what are the challenges ahead that they're going to see, and they were, in these cases, typically using us in lieu of Adobe or some of these very, kind of high-end enterprise commercial tools at the time. And so, trying to think about like, well, what did they like about Adobe that they weren't getting from WordPress, and how do we kind of bridge that gap, or what are the important things that we need to bridge the gap on? And so, that was where we also built a lot of our own IP around it. But yeah, being able to kind of, capture immediate, and then also, with a great, kind of, I would say intake of product feedback, package and build something that's going to be, commercially viable there.
Okay. And so what goes into that commercial packaging? What are the things you have to figure out in terms of commercialization before you can like go out into the market?
Yeah. Well, I think like actually before I jumping into that too, I would say like, that's the question I get is like, I want to, I often get folks coming to me saying, I want to add, this PLG, the sales led, kind of component on there. We think there's going to be interest in this new, market. And that's a tough one, right? If you haven't, gotten those signals, you've gotten those proof points, or you haven't gotten those, kind of early adopters. And so, that's always the start. I'm like, you got to get the early adoption first, or those signals before you do this.
You have to see the pull, you mean?
Yep. The pull is the important part of that. And it often gets left out. I think when I talk to folks about this who are trying to make that leap, and they're too early, and they want to do it because they've seen others do it. And so they're like, I've heard your podcast, or I've seen, kind of others do this. I want to do the same. And so I think you have to figure that piece out first. But I think, the discovery process, like, I think this is a fun one too. I know we're going to talk a lot about like, how sales roles or, sales leadership roles are changing and evolving, but this is a great one for, I would say, younger leaders to lean into, because I think it is completely pulling you outside of your comfort zone to probably go out and do this like kind of product and, kind of packaging, commercialization conversation. But it's probably like, for me, has been the most fulfilling part. It's like being able to saddle up with, the right partners, in this situation. Mm-hmm. So, the case of, WP Engine, I had the, chief product officer with me, as well as the, CTO, and it was, the three of us, kind of, all saddled up thinking together about what are these things that we need to build. And we were getting all that context from the customers. And, then it was also great to do a lot of trial and experimentation and test it out, right? Once we did, kind of the early thinking, and we built some of the early, kind of packaging, like going back to those customers and being able to get that feedback and saying, okay, is this, what you needed there? And is this going to fit your, requirements for future? Also getting to test it with the sales team, right? We were able to go and start, kind of saying, okay, we've now done this for 15, 20 folks. Like, now we want to go do this at scale. And so, those early, kind of sales reps that were part of that journey, I think had a lot of fun, because they were, part of that, kind of trial and error and experimentation process, and being able to get more feedback that, again, continues to shape the product and really helps us think about, what we're bringing to customers and making sure it's right there.
Makes sense. And so what was different about the upmarket offering for WP Engine versus the self-serve offering? Like, what was that initial commercial package?
Yeah. I mean, it's usually, and it always, as I've talked to a lot of other companies that have gone through this, like, there is some just basic table stakes stuff that you have to nail, right? I think like typically yeah, exactly. Security, compliance stuff. I think when, this person made that purchase, like, a lot of times they didn't run it by IT, and they didn't run it by the teams internally. Like the rogue IT purchase is always a fun one, because it's like, okay, that's going to catch up to you. And so, we had to think about all those things. Like, are we going to be able to be, compliant with all the things that they need? Do we have, kind of SSO? Do we have like the kind of basic table stakes stuff that you need to have in there? The other thing is, when you're building for content, creators who are, not doing at the scale of, kind of an enterprise brand, for their .com, you don't think about like, what does traffic look like, and what is, those heavy spike moments. There's always this talk of like, if you got featured on Shark Tank, or if you got featured on the Super Bowl, or if, for some reason, your product was picked up, are you ready and able to scale up, with increased demands? And I would say content, easy. When you start moving into, as from your e-commerce days, when you start thinking about those moments of scale, you have to have something that has, the ability to ramp up and have that resilience. Mm-hmm. And so we honestly, we're starting to build, kind of, separate siloed environments for these customers as well to comply with the security one, but also to give them the amount, the ability to add resources on demand to be able to scale up, scale down as they needed there. Over time, the other thing we started to think about was fault tolerance, right? When I was doing this, everybody said Amazon will never go down. And then there was a US, East outage that took down like 70% of the internet, right? And so I think it was that major panic moment of like,
Wow.
Even Amazon occasionally has hiccups, right? And so, do we need to think about geographic distribution, of our resources so that we can, protect against that? And so it began to scale more and more, over time. And I would say the other things that started to become, more important were, there was a lot of like, if we're getting, DOSed, we need to have like a lot of the DOS prevention, on the front, the security, teams want to have visibility and logs and things like that. And so again, you're starting to, expand outside of what a content, blogger would want and comply with what the enterprise needs there. And that was the fun part about it. And we, built a lot of that on top of, an open source framework, which was, kind of nice to have their core IP to be able to use that was, widely adopted while adding our own pieces on there to tailor this to our user.
How much was customer success and support part of that commercial bundle? Like, was that something that really drove the prospect interest?
Yeah, I would say it's a great call out, and I think that often gets overlooked too. I think it has to be a part of the journey. I think customer success, has a really big piece in this, especially for the ongoing feedback loops that need to be established there. But I think initially, enterprise buyers want to be able to say like, if something goes wrong, I want to be able to call somebody, at a moment's notice, right? Mm-hmm. So like having a generalized phone queue wasn't acceptable for a lot of the enterprise buyers, and it was like, okay, we've got a red phone to basically a support team that knows your infrastructure and is able to, jump right in, whenever something happens there. And so I think it was a good kind of packaging up front, part of the conversation. But I think ongoing, it also became our secret sauce and kind of differentiator and something that we started to think more about. How do we optimize around, in kind of fun and unique ways to make sure that they were, completely covered, supported in the best of ways. And they weren't having to come in to a broad generalized queue, having to explain, hey, I'm,
right.
A very big brand who's having an outage of our website. It was like, when they jumped in, the team that was talking to them was a team that was knowledgeable on what, their instance was doing and understood the implications of downtime and was able to really respond quickly and make things, kind of right away.
Okay, cool. So we've got this initial validation. There's demand. You interview people. We think there's something there. Then this solution and product offering build, product requirements, figuring out what needs to be in this new SLG product, and then commercialization sounds like the next. So like what did you have to go build in order to like take that to market?
Yeah, I would say, the rest is, where a lot of the, kind of work comes in here, but, making sure that you have enterprise grade terms and SLAs and things like that. And, contracts that, are also very friendly to those environments. I do think I have a bit of a, kind of a passion on this topic too, that I think some folks overdo that. So I was like, how do you still make it as very simple as possible? I think a lot of folks maybe listening to this podcast, have products that sell to an enterprise buyer, but probably aren't at an enterprise price tag yet, and so, I oftentimes say like, how do you get, very simple, easy to digest terms, that are, easier to get things through so you can kind of set the seed for a land and expand strategy. You don't want to have this like massive binder that you drop on them. And I think that's where I see folks go wrong as well, is that they do that. And so then they find themselves selling to big brands, and then they get themselves into a big prolonged, procurement negotiation for something that has a really, really low ASP. And so, making the terms.
Binder comes back dripping in red lines.
Yeah, exactly. They don't send you your binder back. They send you their binder back, right?
No.
And that's they want you to work off their paper first, right? But so how do you make it as easy for them to say yes, to be able to get into the arrangement in a way that protects the company, protects their interests, but gets everybody kind of moving swiftly there.
And then
I think the team,
packaging.
Yep, exactly. I would say, all those things from the website to the content that supports it, the messaging that, you need for positioning it, the sales team that you kind of build out to follow you in this journey as well. Like, I think that's something that, is also a really fun part of this is, the team that you're going to need probably 3-4 years from, that initial launch of the product, should change and develop over time. And so how do you bring in the right seller context for that motion, be able to make it very adaptable so that you can add to it or, bring them up in the journey with you there and then continue to scale that out.
Makes sense. And how deep did you go on pricing and packaging before you put something in front of a customer? Was this like a month in the lab cooking up the perfect thing, or did you just sketch out, it's like, all right, let's try 50 grand? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah. It's funny. This is a tricky one. And, I think it's probably somewhere in between, Kyle. I think there is obviously there were a lot of meetings to discuss, like, what is, our actual cost and what do we need to see, to be able to make this, market viable. I think there was, some element of stretch here, right? We were taking, customers from, $29 plans to plans types that were $5,000 a month, right, and above.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's a lot of jump there. And so making sure, it's justified and it's, it's substantiated and kind of what you're bringing to market there, super important. I think there will always be some trial and error, on that too. I think that's, kind of getting it right, getting it out there, and then iterating on it is super important there. So, not months in the lab, but maybe a month in the lab with, with some science to it. I've heard of others who are like, yeah, I just looked at my closest competitor and, said, if they can do it for that, I should be able to do that for that as well. And I'm like, okay, like that's, not always the best way to do it. There's something to be said about like, kind of that in between there.
And so what was the difference between sort of, call that a tops down version? Okay, let's look at what the market is. Where do we want to be relative versus the bottoms up? What is my cost to sell, cost to serve, and where do I need to be from a viability? Was it equal weighting of both? Or do you encourage, especially like companies on this journey now, where should they spend their focus on those two parts of the spectrum?
It's back in the middle is kind of, I think, like really where you want to gear. I mean, obviously it has to be anchored in, the bottoms up there, if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. But I think, it needs to be a bit of a stretch, it needs to be aspirational. I think also, you don't want to start too low, obviously, because, it's going to be a slog to move the, the marker up over time. And especially, as you acquire, maybe hundreds of customers in those first few years, like, you're stuck with that. I think that's the problem is, once you kind of set an expectation, it's hard to change it from a pricing perspective there. And so I think it's, it's really a sweet spot in between of like the, bottoms up and the tops down, kind of narrowed in kind of somewhere in the middle there.
And did you do it internally or did you hire a consultant to partner on pricing?
Yeah, we did it internally. The last 2 or 3 companies that I've been a part of, we did it internally, and I think if you have the resources and the maturity and the folks to do it, like, perfect way to do it. I think I've hired outside consultants in my career as well to bring them in. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, super helpful as well, especially if like things got, if you don't have the resourcing or the time internally or the expertise, like bring in an expert. Because they will save you, and they'll be able to really draw on, lots of other, repeatable experience that they've had there. I do think also, they can also help future-proof yourself a little bit too. I think that's the downside of doing it yourself and being scrappy is you can probably get it to market quicker, but you may get it wrong. And so just having an extra set of eyes isn't a bad thing.
And how big was WP Engine before this whole SLG transformation?
Yeah. So it was probably about 150 employees, maybe. Okay. Revenues wise, we were about 30 million in revenues. Really efficient business, I would say. Largely, the sales team was really not, truly a sales team at that time. Like I would say it was, because the purchasing decision was super simple. It was, go to the website, pick a plan, right? So we had, kind of SDRs there that were, capable of guiding a purchase decision and helping them pick between plan types. And, over time, that's where we started to think about the maturity, of how do you go now to market and go find others, that match that profile of those 25 customers we had. So, bringing more outbound prospecting, kind of segmentation into the mix. And so we had to start to think about, kind of iterating towards that muscle and bringing in people who were, true professional sellers who could think about, outbounding, managing a sales process from end to end, and then also being able to manage those customers when we brought them on board. Like the support team we had was, like you mentioned, it was a transactional support queue. And so like we were then going to, kind of large customers, deeper relationships, that valued deeper, expertise and knowledge there.
Mm-hmm. And so after you figure out your commercialization plan, pricing, packaging, SLAs, terms, is next team build, or are you doing playbook design first, like the sales process design, or are those in tandem? Or is there a step I missed?
Yeah, no, you're nailing it. I'm sorry, I was smiling about the process. I forgot where your home base
Canadian?
is. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
I get this all the time.
reminded by that. I love it. But yeah, no, I think, I mean, for most folks, that are listening to this and when we were going through it, we were doing a lot of this in tandem. Like we were actually bringing in new talent while the time we were doing a lot of this, like, kind of lift of work and getting people out there. We did some early, I would say, light, kind of playbook stuff too. Like what is, kind of the profile of the customer? What is the pitch deck and, kind of messaging that we need? How are we going to prospect into those customers? And then we iterated and we evolved it over time and really, started to bolster and add to it. And I would say, in year one, it probably wasn't world class. It was, kind of the fastest path to get us, up and running. And I think year two is, when we really started to think about, okay, now we're starting to scale this with some repeatability. During the time I was there, which was almost 4 years, we were doubling in size the sales team, every single year.
Wow.
And, not only were we doubling it, which meant a lot of hiring and a lot of onboarding and a lot of, kind of getting people ramped and ready, but we also were changing, kind of the profile. We started to see success with like the early segments of our focus. And so then we were like, okay, let's move even further up market, right? Let's expand out into new segments, which means probably, folks that have done this at that level mixed with folks that are really showing, kind of the willingness to learn and the ability to pick things up quickly. And so, it is, really important to focus in on those playbooks and repeatability when you start to get to that point there and start to think about that. And so I think that's when we had to have, start to think about world-class onboarding and really great training and really great enabling to be more, kind of professionally ready and faster to get those reps ramped.
Makes a ton of sense. So let's triple click into this team build. So there was a handful of reps that were doing sort of like concierge, help you pick a plan. Yep. But then at some point you said like, we need bag carrying reps. And so what was the profile of that initial group of reps that you hired? How many did you hire? How early? You just give me the framework there.
Yeah. Rough numbers because it was a while ago, but I would say, like my, best guess, probably about let's just say 10 or 15 folks in that first year that we hired. We were hiring a lot from the outside. We took some of the folks that were internal, which was great to just kind of seed some of this. But we realized quickly, like those folks hadn't been, in this type of motion. They hadn't carried the bag, as you mentioned. They hadn't been, kind of doing the things that you needed. And so we needed to bring in folks who had done it because it just accelerates the journey a lot quicker. And so we started to do that. I would say early profile. Super important that you're nailing that because I think that's important to get squared off on. Like stage, fit is important. Like, are they ready for early stage? Are they able to be like flexible, adaptable, agile? And so you are looking for folks that, just have that natural like curiosity, grit, tenacity, and have maybe worked at smaller startups that have gone recently through this journey, right? So they understand like every day we may be, kind of trying new things and that's okay. We may have to redirect, and change and they're not going to be, too rattled or set off course, right? And I think that's always, you've done this a lot too, Kyle. I'm sure you've seen, the stage fit and mistake happen where people are like, well, we're going to go compete with Adobe. So like, let's go grab some reps from Adobe because they'd be great for this. And like the Adobe rep, freaks out in like the first week and quits because they say like, there's no onboarding, there's no training, like there's no manual. I need the manual, where, we're doing that. And I think, like, if you pick the right ones, these were, typically still, I would say, early stage sellers in their career too. Like, the right ones, will lean into this and will really enjoy it and actually see, like, this is going to be so important for my career to go through this, right? Like, being able to work, closely with the CRO, when there's not a lot of layers at the time, was like really important for that team. As I recall, like, they were, really deep in it with product and giving good feedback on, how things are going and what features we were commonly hearing. But I think you get the right mindset. I think that's also something that just has to be part of it. So get the stage fit right, get to be folks that are, adaptable, scalable, and, excited about taking something like this on.
How similar was the profile at Canva versus WP Engine?
Yeah, it was a different animal. And I will say your questions are good, because I think, every time I've done this, thankfully I've gotten smarter as I've gone through this, and I don't hopefully repeat the mistake, twice too many times. But Canva's journey was an interesting one, similar to kind of like what I was talking about with, WP Engine. I actually met with the founders, two young founders at the time. They were 32, husband and wife, Mel and Cliff. And, when I met with them, I actually was like, I'm going to hear them out. I would love to hear what they're thinking about. But, like, they are consumer, and, my background is not consumer. So, like, probably not not going to be my fit here. And I was quickly, pleasantly surprised, similar to what I was talking about, with WP Engine. They started to see those early signs and signals. They had, I think, upwards of like almost 200 customers that had popped up at all the big companies. Like, you could just name off, kind of some of the biggest, brands out there. And it was teams of 10, 20 people that spun up Canva and brought it to work. And so, kind of similar to the Dropbox story of how they kind of landed in enterprise. It was, folks who needed things, to get done. They went to the internal design teams, again, similar, kind of resource challenges, but they went to the designers and said, I need a pitch deck for tomorrow. Like, I'm pitching an oil and gas client, and I need to get these case studies in there, or this, kind of a couple of slides built in there. And the, design team at the time said, we'll get to you in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, put a ticket in. And so they were like, I can't wait. I'm going to Canva. And so, that was our kind of like, it's a, kind of cool moment in time of like, we're starting to see this tipping point. How do we capture this moment? How do we, we think about it? And I would say it was trickier too, Kyle, because I think the folks who were choosing it, weren't our buyers, so kind of in that interview kind of conversation that I had, those 20 people at Microsoft who spun up Canva, all 20 of them probably didn't even know they were all using it. They weren't using it collaboratively. And so that was a big opportunity to be spotted really quickly. They weren't decision makers. They were frontline individual contributors in sales and marketing and employee experience. Doers who just needed to get the job done, right? And so they were, picking this tool to be able to do it. And so, our sale wasn't with them, the, discovery that we needed to build the right product wasn't with them either, right? Because, a lot of them were like, my boss doesn't know I'm using this, and I probably would prefer that they didn't know. And IT surely doesn't know, so please don't tell them, because they probably would block it at the firewall. And so, it was great for us to see that challenge and understand that the buyer was, even further, up. We realized that the CMO tended to be it, who owns those creative resources, and designers. It's usually in the marketing department. And so we went to a bunch of CMOs at those different orgs, and just said, hey, look, we've got this, idea that we're thinking about, we're already seeing some, early signs of success. Like, help us think about, how you would use this in your environment and what you'd need. And like, they gave us some really great early feedback too. They were, all the table stakes were there, like, make sure that it can pass, the IT compliance situation, and also make sure that we're not exposing, customers, PII or anything like that. That was there, but it was even bigger than that. It was like, gosh, all these people are creating content. That's my worst nightmare if I'm a CMO, because John and Kyle, the sales guys, go out there and, put my, kind of presentation in hot pink because it pops, and that's not our brand colors, and that's not cool at all. And so it made us realize really quickly, like, we got to build something that's different. We've got to have something in there that has, brand controls, right? artfully called it freedom within a framework, because I think when CMOs love brand controls and brand people love brand controls, I think individuals who are trying to
Everybody
get a
else
job,
doesn't.
they don't like control. It turns out, and so. But yeah, we put that into the product immediately. Canva has all this robust power in it for a consumer, but I think also, what we found was that the CMOs were like, I don't want them to have access to your image library. Like, your image library is massive, and that's great. But, that means, again, John and Kyle might put CrossFit photos in our corporate presentation, and that's not a good thing either. So,
Yeah.
it was about, okay, we need to integrate with their, kind of photo libraries. We need to be able to put, brand, kind of guidelines in place there. We need to make sure that it, is, able for them to collaborate and, also have, the right org structure in mind, right? So sales has its own, kind of organization built into the tool. Marketing has its own. And so, it's not just the, if you've ever used Canva, you can see all the designs that you've created, and that's, a great thing. But if you're an organization, you don't want to see everybody's designs all at once. You want to see the ones that matter to you, right? And so it was almost a whole new product, built on the backs and the code that we had for our consumer product, but it was a completely different one, which was fun to figure that out, understand that, and think about, okay, that's a new context that we need to take into account here.
So building that solution was quite different than building the WP Engine enterprise solution.
Yeah,
more
because it was probably a little bit more of a challenged, I would say, navigation to the solution that we brought to market, because it, was just being used in a different way, right? And I think the way that folks were using WordPress, for their own use, and then the business was kind of similar, so look and feel kind of stayed the same. Whereas Canva, we had to take it and kind of completely make it a bit of a different animal there.
Okay. So how different, going back to this question about team building, how different was the profile of your early Canva reps versus early WP Engine reps?
Very similar. So I'd say, like, actually, that's, that is something that I, kept consistent. Again, knowing, what works. We started with folks that were adaptable, that really enjoyed, like, figuring out the problem and were there for the journey, but also, had the, ability to kind of roll with change, which was important there. And I think back to my comment about what did I, do better this time, we rolled out enablement early. Like, we knew we were going to have traction with this. We were already seeing, some really great signs. Like, a lot of those CMOs we interviewed, they were like, sign us up for your beta and let us know when it's ready and available. And It was like, okay, there's something really exciting here. And so, knowing that, it was like, okay, we've got to have really great onboarding. We have to have great, messaging. We have to get great, kind of tooling right out of the gates too. Like, I think a lot of times, if you're doing this, on your own and starting out, you're basically, kind of, bootstrapping, your IT budget. So your tech spend, and your tech stack is pretty simple. We were making some of those investments early, which was kind of fun to have that ability to see that and then put the right foundation in place early.
Okay. So I wanted to ask one more team build question, and then I want to get into the infrastructure as you're sort of getting to now. So what were the key roles? So say you're through year one at WP Engine, or some of these happened earlier at Canva. What was the waterfall of, like, okay, I got to have a bunch of reps and a manager, and then next is enablement, or you had to hire dedicated rev ops? What were the key roles that you prioritized?
Yeah, sequencing is important. And I think they were somewhat similar between the two. Like, there were some definite themes, but I think, like, sellers, when you're just trying to get as much kind of coverage and feedback and get, into as many folks' hands as possible, like, the first investments were AE team, right? Like, let's get, kind of 4 or 5, 6 of them. You probably need a leader, right? I think actually when you're, you got 1 to 2, you can kind of think about, like, how do we really, kind of still run agile. But I think, once we started to have multiples and realizing that they were, need to be working together cohesively, consistently, like, we brought in the managers. So I'd say, like, quick build out was AE, kind of, and then, kind of your first, leader there. CSM was a big one for us too, as well. Like, I think just, making sure that we, when we handed these customers over, they all had those expectations, like you mentioned. And so they really wanted a white glove support experience and an onboarding experience. And so we, had CSM teams, that were kind of scaled out in a small version of like 5 to 6 of them, kept them really, tightly coupled AMs and CSMs, almost in a one-to-one relationship, and then just iterated and evolved and kind of, worked on top of that. I think other things too, like I think, we started focused, I think that's another thing that I want to definitely like iterate with everybody here is that, you start to thinking, I'm going to move into this new massive TAM that is, kind of maybe mid-market enterprise, to the moon, Fortune 1000 here. Focus on where you can, kind of get some early wins and build some momentum. And so I think in both businesses, we really geared towards that kind of mid-market. We just saw that was, where we were, and I love mid-market. Actually, I would say, you often hear about people who sell S&B and enterprise, and mid-market gets forgotten a lot of times, but it's, the wide middle in between. And I think you get so much, great at bats for mid-market. I think that they're at the right size, that they're not too complex to buy, or, buy solutions like yours. You tend to find a lot of them are, the next kind of wave of big companies that are coming up, or they're aspiring to be that. And so, they're also thinking about, kind of new things and doing things differently versus, like the enterprise wants to know it's repeatable and everybody else is using it. The mid-market would be more, apt to take this on. And so we started, I'd say kind of lower mid-market and then expanded to upper mid-market and then later opened up kind of enterprise, when the time was right. And as we kind of saw the momentum, kind of carrying us that way.
Yeah. And so you mentioned you wanted to roll out enablement earlier at Canva because you sort of knew early you were going to go big. What point was that you brought in an enablement person? What was it, a team size? Was it a trajectory? What were the metrics or inputs that led to that decision?
Yeah, it was probably like after year one, so it wasn't almost immediately. Like I think we had a lot of other things that we were prioritizing, in tandem, but I would say like it was again, a pretty fast follow. And it was, I think when the teams, kind of hit kind of a critical mass of like 15, 20 folks, with more, again, more follow on, like we knew that there was going to be more expansion, it was, kind of about timing and thinking through some of those things. And so it was, it's perfect to get, the right, leader in there. And I would say we started with just, an enablement leader who was, kind of wearing multiple hats and also able to do, kind of the work of a full stack enablement team, and then, over time they were, with success able to augment and then be able to split their workload a little bit more. But yeah, finding someone who was, also very similar to that profile, had done this maybe before, had been through this kind of phase and journey of a build with a company. And so understood like, what are the things to focus on? Like, is it going to be, just onboarding? Is it going to be ongoing? Is it going to be product release training, right? How do you think through all those pieces? Because there's some sequencing that needs to go on there too.
So both of these companies had dominant consumer products, like 7 to 8% of the entire internet's wild for WordPress. And so that is, like a credit to your company picking and also profile, but not everybody's going to be so lucky. And not everybody is going to have a solution that is enterprise ready and you can just go with. What are the signals that a revenue leader should be looking for to invest or pull back? What are the metrics that you're really trying to pay attention to that gives you the input on that decision?
Yeah. I mean, at this stage, I tend to be more of a metric-driven guy, but at this stage, unfortunately, like your data is limited because it's new, right? And I think your insights are, somewhat, challenged. And so I think, you need to get there as soon as possible. But again, like you don't have the luxury at that time sometimes. And so I think that, the things that I always think about is like build a culture of experimentation. And I think that's, so critical, wherever you go. Like, I think that's probably like one thing that you should just always keep, kind of in the back of your mind. But being able to make bets and experiments at times, if you can, and I think the early days, I think some people think it's going to be costly to do it. It's like you can actually, if you hire the right people, with the right, kind of motor and the right orientation, like they can be, kind of your path to experimentation. Like they can do, kind of what they normally do, and then this other thing, right? And that can allow you to test and see, can we get some traction on this? And so there's been a lot of times, even in Rackspace where we were like, gosh, I think that there is a, commercially viable like product that we could build right here because we're hearing these signals here. What if we just kind of, again, hack something together, from a solution standpoint and have one of our sellers, like, again, focus on it, with, kind of their nights and weekends and, work on that. And in most of those cases, like it allows you to really kind of see, what's possible. And, if there is some there, and then you can kind of double down on those, experiments or pull back. Like, I think there's been plenty of times where we've tried stuff and, a couple of months later, like that's, individual, who's, you got to build a real tight, kind of communication loop and may say like, yeah, we did it for 90 days. And like, everybody says they want it, but nobody's willing to pay for it. Or everybody says that, it's the thing that they need, but actually once they got it, they didn't need it after all. And so like, you just, you have to have that ability to be, able to adapt quickly, experiment, try things. And then when they are working, that's when you start to double down and get more methodical about the data too, and starting to think about like, okay, we now aligned one rep on this. That one rep's completely, overwhelmed at this point. Like, okay, is there time to start thinking about, the second rep and, what are the metrics we need to think about for the third and fourth, and so you start to get to a point where you can model this out here.
And are you paying attention there to LTV CAC as the North Star? Is it a conversion rate metric? Like, what are the things that CROs should be looking most carefully at to tell them whether or not they're ready to make that next level of investment?
Yeah. I think like LTV and CAC are, I think, the heartbeat of the business right now, and everybody should be in tune with it. I think at this point in the juncture though, we weren't as focused on that at that moment. It was more about like, kind of trialing, if we had, something that was, again, going to have some traction, and then could we, work on that, make sure that it's, repeatable. And I think, the data orientation is a good one. Like, I actually love that you're hitting on this, Kyle, because I think oftentimes, other folks may not go back and think about that piece or think about, the scaling factors and, the cost implications to do that. And so you need to get there. But I think just looking at, kind of your root level costs at the beginning, and then when you start to get into a modeled out behavior, then you start to think about like, what is the rep payback period on this? What is the, the customers that are acquiring, how sticky are they? What is the cost to acquire them? Those things start to really, materialize before you. And then you can make decisions on if this is a good business or a bad business to continue to do. And also, you can think about how you scale the sales team on it. Like, I think, the PLG motion, was one that had a great, kind of, I would say like a great, kind of moment, and everybody really wanted that because it was super efficient there, and now that some of the allure has faded on it, or maybe it's just kind of the hype cycle is kind of, is maybe gone down a little bit. It still makes a ton of sense. And so I think like thinking about that, it's important. Like, okay, is it really costly to acquire these customers? Like, is there a better way to do it? Right? Is there a more efficient strategy? Could it be service through PLG, in the product now that we've proven that there's traction here and customers want the thing we're selling? Can we use, even, kind of a scaled out sales team for it too? I think that's the thing that everybody's getting really good at these days, is thinking through costs and making those decisions in the right way, and then adapting the team to make sure that we're in line with those.
Are you a B2B tech CRO, VP of Sales, or VP of Revenue Operations? Join over 200 of your peers at CRO Summit 2025, a one-day executive-only event designed to help you tackle the challenges of today and position you for growth tomorrow. Hosted at the Denver Art Museum, this summit combines cutting-edge insights and actionable strategies. Learn from industry pioneers covering all aspects of sales and revenue growth into 2026 with sessions from Andrea Kayal of Help Scout, Guy Rubin of Ebsta, Wendy Sturgis of Cleverbridge, and more. Visit joinpavilion.com/CRO-summit to secure your spot today.
How long does it take to know if a sales-led motion is driving accretive growth? At what point are you just closing customers that may otherwise have closed? And were there metrics or data that you really paid attention to know that this was incremental, like it was
Yeah.
truly incremental to the business?
Yeah. Big one to highlight there, and I would say, every business that starts to bring in these new kind of motions, you need to be thinking about that, right? Are we cannibalizing one for the other? Is
Mm-hmm.
that's the case? Like that's an important thing to see and spot and call out. And, maybe it's the right thing to do because we are able to get, kind of more, ASP through that, et cetera. But I would say like, you can't lose sight of that. And so, when I was at WP Engine, actually, they were really smart about that, where we put almost kind of a firewall between the two businesses there. There was a leader that was accountable to self-serve and kind of sign up. And then I took on everything that was sales led, from there on out. And so, it made a healthy, I would say, a healthy conversation. We reported together. We sat in the same meetings together with marketing because, things that marketing were doing, they at the time, hopefully drove customers to both, right? I think where we were a better business because of, having all these different, kind of things going at the same time, but also understanding like what is a good fit, I think for our enterprise offering. And so we set it based on company size, which made it really easy to say, okay, if this is a small company, like it's never going to be, something that we want to put a seller on. And I think that was a good, denotation that we had. And so, occasionally a Patagonia would self-sign up and we knew, okay, like, Patagonia self-signed up, like that needs to be, kind of rerouted into the right team's hands here. And we need to make sure that we put them in the right solution out of the gates. But otherwise, like we want both businesses to grow, we want them both to be successful. And I think the total enterprise value increases if both are successful, but you have to think through that. At Canva, I had actually the full spectrum reporting to me and I had different leaders, for each of them. And, very similarly, like we had said very early on, like we're not going to sell to companies under, 300, the enterprise solution, because, those, under 300 employees, like they probably could get by using our consumer or pro version, and that's going to be just fine, right? And so like, let's not, because cannibalization, I think is one part of it. I think, your sales costs really spiral if you put a sales rep on everything, right? And I think that's a failure that some people, make is they basically say like, yeah, hey, they want to talk to a salesperson, so we should let them talk to a salesperson. I'm like, well, like we should find another way to cover why they need to talk to a salesperson if they're a small business, because that's really just going to blow our cost structure out of the out of the water here. And so, again, set some lines that make sure that you are, clear in which goes where and why one exists over the other, and why a customer would choose one over the other. And make sure that you maintain that structure and strategy so that you're not taking from one just to make the other one look good.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in both of these examples, you're selling a completely different product because I see companies add a sales-led motion to the same core offering, but they think it can drive win rate improvements and let them close deals that are bigger, but on the same product because the seat number. Have you seen scenarios where the product can be the same, but just they're up market, or should, as a principle, people be thinking about building a distinct product with distinct features for up market?
Yeah, good question. I think actually, so I've seen both. I would say the quick answer on this is I've seen folks build a product that's scalable across single user all the way up to large teams and enterprises, and that's great if you can do that. And it just changes the kind of the way you think about this. I think for us splitting was good because I think it actually made this a lot easier and made it a little bit harder to cannibalize things. And it wasn't just to protect against that. It was because the buyers were different, right? But I think ideally I'd love, it would be a lot easier for the product team, if we had one platform to maintain at scale. But I don't think sometimes that just can't happen. And so that's oftentimes why you split the segment there. I think, one of the things that I really love that you called out is we did think, about the end-to-end continuum of customers. And as I mentioned, we weren't selling to under 300, for Canva. And so we had teams signing up at those companies, and we wanted to grow them, and we realized quickly that they weren't growing past a certain point, like 5, 10 people signed up.
Right.
Again, kind of similar patterns. Those 5 to 10 people didn't know each other, were using it, so they weren't getting any benefit off of collaboration and being, in a team together there. And it wasn't happening on its own. Like the product, I think this is something that you see too, is in your early days, your product, starts to spread virally, but I think you'll start to find these different stall points. And we found these in enterprise, we found them in SMB, and even in consumer. And so we even introduced a different, kind of touch point. We called it Canva coaches at the time, but it was, kind of like in the PLG context. It was like an SDR. It was, probably a mesh between like a great support rep and seller who, was able to, we set up a whole, system around this where it was like a team of 5 or 10 people just signed up. Like, can we do some scaled webinars with them? Can you walk them through the product at times? Can you put them accessible? We tested some different prompts where it was like, do you want to talk to a Canva coach? We chose that name just because it was like, okay, like I think if you said, hey, do you want to talk to sales?
It's inviting.
Like yeah, it felt a little bit, kind of threatening, in that, we want to sell them something. It's like, no, we just want to make sure that you're getting the full value out of the product. And I mean, they learned really quickly too. And I think this is just a good example for others, what the things that helped, these teams scale from 5, 10, 20 was knowing they were in a team together. So they were able to share and see, what's working for others. When they created, I think we found quickly that they created like 20 designs in the first month. Like this was a great, turning point, and that's where they went viral. And so it was like, we can't wait for that to happen on its own. Right. And so how do we, sometimes, intercept them in those moments and make sure that they have, somebody who's there to take them through that journey. And so I share that example because I would say, like, if you had a full spectrum product and you were adding sales led on it, you probably want to, again, know where your cost structure supports having a sales touch point and where it doesn't. and where it doesn't, you can optimize along that way. And then I think the fun part is where it does, there's probably a couple of different flavors and cuts of your segmentation of like, okay, what level of sales team and touch points do we need on there to be able to maximize this opportunity, right? And so, on top of that, motion, even in Canva today, they have a corporate, a mid-market, and an enterprise, and now a strategic motion. And each of those, have different profiles of sellers, with different, kind of territory assignments there. The CSMs on the, on the backs of the teams there, are supporting, sometimes bigger amounts of customers, sometimes, thousands of customers, whereas like our strat accounts, we're working with, kind of like, few to one, kind of relationships and support. So you start to think about those decisions, and it's, it's largely guided around like what sets the right costs, kind of basis here, what provides the best customer experience and allows us to continue to grow those customers. And so it gets to be, I don't know, you can probably hear me getting more excited about it, but I'd say like, this is the fun part of the sales go-to-market puzzle that you're solving is, really layering in, where do you put the sales talent, where do you put the right, team in place, and how do you do it with all those things in mind?
Yeah. And the line between sales and growth or sales and product, I think, is more blurred today than ever. When you start to think about putting agents on top of things or building, okay, we have our key product metric that we know drives adoption and a flywheel. Let's go drive that. Typically you could have done that with a person, but now we use this solution called Pavlov, which has all of the business intelligence in the platform so that it can identify those key metrics, and then we build campaigns to go drive that outcome. And we're thinking about ways to, as we're sort of like on this journey ourselves, ways to apply humans and product in tandem. So I call it semi self-serve sometimes, where maybe it's reactive and proactive. So you could be in a self-serve journey and then raise your hand to get help. Or if we see people stall out, we can deploy resources to it proactively. I think where the world is going, that line is going to get blurred. And this is probably a good transition note to talk about Okay, like what the heck does this mean for CROs? Because before we started recording, you mentioned how you felt like this was a time that will be tough for CROs, and the market's going through a big transitionary moment. So like just give me your thoughts on what you mean by that, because I think it's fascinating.
So much there. Look, and I love you just exposing, just that sliver of, kind of where your head's at and where your team's focusing on. I've heard great things about Pavlov, by the way, as well. And so like, cool to hear that you all are using it there. I think, you hit the nail on the head. The world is shifting and changing. Like when I was at, Canva, I think it was probably like the beginnings of some of this shifting here. And, that was in, 2020. And I remember, kind of sales had never been a part of the company's DNA. So it was really, largely if you have a consumer business, it's typically product and marketing. And so I was this like whole new thing that they brought in, and I was building teams, around that. And it, was a little wonky in the beginning, I will say, and I think that others, again, who are listening to this might be in this kind of journey too, where all well-intentioned, the three of us started to work almost in a very siloed format, kind of like you do at a very big company, which is like death to a small company, right? And so we quickly realized like we're not in sync, we're not doing things that, kind of like work together and pull through. And so we started to change everything. Like we changed like the meeting cadence, the way that we communicate, actually the way we present. And, I think actually it was, one of the founders, had a slide that they created for, my arm, which was sales and success. And then there was marketing, and then there was product, and it was, three concentric circles, kind of overlapping, and that was, kind of our, kind of triumvirate there. But I think, that's the way the world's going. Like, I think you've got to be, I'll definitely take it to the topic on CROs today, but, I'd say being so in sync with product is like key and critical. And I think, also back to your story, there's a constant balancing act that you're going on with like, people are expensive, and, I think that they add value when applied correctly. And so I think there's a bit of, hopefully there's some tension, and, all works about, how do we solve this with the products, and can it be, self-serve, but then how do we make, humans accessible at a moment's notice, right? And I think that's how consumers want, things too. Like, I think like, I'm speaking for myself, and I'd say I hear this often, in most products, it's like, I want to be able to do it myself for the simple stuff. Like, I don't want to have to bother with somebody, but like, there are times when we get stuck, right? And it's like, I don't want to, go into, a massive call queue or, triage system. I want to be able to just signal that at that moment. And like, that would be a great thing. And so finding that balance of, product, humans, kind of how we orchestrate and kind of hand the baton back and forth is like so important and powerful. And, I think also, last rant on this, and then I will move on. Like, you probably use, humans a lot in the beginning. And then you start to realize like, it's maybe not adding a ton of value. And some of these things have become more repeatable. And it's like, okay, like, product evolves, like move, the team in a new direction, right? And this is where you get some more bandwidth for experimentation and some of the other things. But I think that's, a conversation that everybody should be having. And I think it really kind of comes back to what's the best experience for the customer, what's the best, way to grow them as a customer or get their adoption really, really high. And like, what's the right way to manage our costs? And I think those three things can exist together. But you need to have that healthy dialogue and back and forth there.
So is this the big transitionary moment you're talking about? Sort of the blending of sales and product, or what did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I just think I think most orgs go through that. And I think for us as an, evolution, it was a little weird that we didn't have them at the beginning altogether, kind of starting out. I think most companies tend to build, kind of all those functions. So I was more of a late entrant, and I was probably the, accelerant or the catalyst to get them to figure that out and think through, how we collaborate. And so, I think it was just an aha moment for me too, that I think, again, you need to be as a really successful sales leader, someone who's building a team around growth, like you have to be in sync with product. Like it's non-negotiable. And I think like how you do it, I think I hear so many great examples from teams today, about how you can do it in lots of new, unique ways. And I think that's the power, is like keep adapting it and thinking through that, but staying in sync is critical.
Okay. So why is today the toughest time to be a CRO, in your opinion?
Yeah. As I say, I appreciate you bringing that one up. And, Kyle and I were talking before we jumped on here, but just talking about how things are going. And I made the comment that, look, I talked to a lot of my peers, Kyle talks to a bunch of folks, of course, as well. And, I think we've all kind of seen, that sales is changing. It's adapting. I think the last 5 years, I would say have been all uniquely nuanced in different ways. You had the pandemic, which I think was a lot of just kind of how do we adapt to this new kind of way of working, and how do we adapt to this new style. Everybody went distributed there. You then had kind of the subsequent, I would say, like tougher times and recessionary years that came after that, where it was like do more with less, and we all went through that. I think I talked to so many friends who were like, gosh, like we slashed back our costs so much that like now we can't do anything because we went too hard into do more with less. Right. And so,
Can't grow anymore.
it becomes about, ruthless prioritization, which I think is in some ways has been good, but I would say like some people are still recoiling from that, where, again, I think in another year or cycle where, there's still a lot of volatility. Like I think the, clear skies haven't shown up yet. And, that's been interesting. And I would say like expectations from investors, board, be it venture, be it private equity, like have not let up. And so, if you are a CRO out there, like I hear you and feel you, it's a tough time. And I think, the conversations that I continuously have is also about what's being expected of a CRO, which I think is what makes it really hard. The demands, as I mentioned, haven't been let up on. They continue to get more complex. Introducing AI, I think that was the other thing that I keep hearing from everybody, that AI will save us and it's going to replace the team and it's going to do this and that. And so there's a lot of noise around that. And I think CROs need to be able to parse through that, because I think it absolutely will add a lot of value in the process and make us better here. But I think not all AI is, the right solution. And when you mix that with the reality of all of us have sales stacks, typically that are, heavily bloated already, underutilized by teams today, like it really compounds things. So you got that. I think the, the talent game has been an interesting one too. I do feel like just watching, this over the past few years, like the beginning of the pandemic, like there wasn't enough people, and I felt like costs were spiraling, and people were kind of stealing, taking, paying, whatever it took to get folks there, and then there was a recoil that came after that, and I think that like teams are, in some cases, been dealing with the do more with less as well. So they're nearing burnout in some cases. So you have some exhaustion from the team, and, heavy fatigue there around your talent there. And then the management of the board expectations. Like, I think that's the one that, everybody I talk to is just like, gosh, like I can't get out of the quicksand that I feel like I'm running in right now. And I got to keep reporting quarterly, yet I can't spend the time or make the changes I need to. So it's complicated. And I think, maybe my brighter skies moment on this, or my positive piece on this is, it's making us better. Like, I think actually, as someone who has lived through 2 or 3 recessionary moments already, this is kind of my third, maybe, I maybe hated it when I was going through it. It was painful, but I was growing and I didn't know it. And I do think, I already am seeing it on the other side of that. I think the, orientation to metrics, like I think that was something that I really enjoyed seeing. That a lot of sales leaders know their business, like they are, CFO level, kind of agile and able to understand it. Where before, when it was grow at all costs, it was like we didn't care what it cost, right? And now we have to care, and that's the right thing. I think you end up, really being that bridge builder and alignment builder between, product and marketing, like I talked about. So I think that's a really great thing, and it means you're probably growing, as well in those areas without knowing it there. By building those bridges, you're becoming a more well-rounded leader who understands, not just your craft and, how to build and scale and motivate sales teams. You understand how product works, right? And how to drive requirements to them.
Yeah.
You understand how marketing works, because you're tightly coupled, or maybe, driving a lot of the demand gen there. And so anyways, I feel like the CROs that come out of this era, or are built in this era are going to be different. I feel like, different times in my career as well, what was required of a CRO 20 years ago, is completely different, than what's, I think
For sure.
is required today. And I think it's going to be neat to see, what that looks like when we all go through this and make it to a more stable time.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear your opinion on this take. I feel like we've seen the same thing in the revenue talent market as we've seen in venture. There's been a flight to quality. And, you hear, oh, the venture market's tough and there's, no liquidity. And so, funds are going to be smaller. But then you look at the biggest and best companies are still raising it at huge numbers.
Yeah.
Like Sierra, Brett Taylor's new companies raised 275 million in like a basically seed. They did 100 and 175 both last year from massive names. So like where there are high profile founders or really good traction, there's plenty of money. And I think when I talk to folks, when I talk to revenue leaders, I think the ones who are really good are swimming in opportunity. I mean, there's a bunch of people that have been trying to get on your attention that I know, and because I'm sure your funnel of interesting things is amazing. But I think if you're maybe a middle of the pack revenue leader, it's actually a very unkind market because the bar from founders is much higher. They're like, I need somebody great. I can't have somebody only okay. I see this a bunch with folks who I mentor or I'm trying to like make an introduction for, or even reps, folks that have come through my teams over the years. My best reps are swimming in interesting opportunities. Like, a few of them have done career transitions and the market seems great. But then also there's some folks that, don't have that same profile, don't have the track record of performance in president's clubs. And it's fairly unforgiving. What do you think about that as like a general observation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. I think there's a lot of disparity, and I think you're right. It's a friendly market for some. It's a rough, brutal market for others, right? Like you mentioned with, different companies and investors. And so look at it, it is tough. I think if you're in that, kind of, in a, that middle category and you're really great, but you're just not quite proven yet, like it's a tough time to break through. It doesn't mean it's not, can't happen, but you're right. The at bats are probably not as high. I think the opportunities are, less and less. And look, I think hopefully it, puts that right chip on the shoulder on those folks. I think, when going through that and provides the right motivation, because it's a bit of a beat down. And so I think that's just something to keep in mind there. But I do think we are close to some of the settle out here, I guess. Like I'm not an economist, don't claim to be one, but I do think that the settle out is happening, like you mentioned, with companies. Like I feel like bold statement by John Eitel, but I think there is a lot of companies that were acquired by private equity firms in the last 4 or 5 years, that were not great companies as well, and I think they were probably sold at the right time in that moment there, and so they're changing out all the leadership, right, and they're grinding out those folks, and so I think there's. I hear a lot of folks who are like, what do you think about this opportunity? I'm like, it's going to be tough. And I think there's certain things you can't change, right? So just, you need to make sure when you're assessing, what their challenges are, are they, are those things how to fix, or, have at least some ideas on how to fix, and will be empowered to do it. But I think that settle out is happening. It's happening in venture too, not to pick on just private equity, but I think that's, there's a whole category, just like there's people, there's a whole category of companies, that may not be around. They might not be around. And that's just important as you are doing your search on this topic here, is like assess them and understand, and I think that a company that hasn't grown, for the last year isn't going to magically grow when you show up there, right? It's going to take, some real change, and it's probably going to take some change in things that might not be in your control, right? I think that I'm always wary of a time where someone's like, our product's great, market fit's amazing. If we just had a great sales team, like we'd be, incredible. And oftentimes, there's a lot more to that story, right? Like, I think that, that's always a red flag in my mind. When they talk about we're positioning you or hiring you to reaccelerate growth, like that's a big task. So make sure you got you got the tools and the empowerment to do that.
So what's your framework for company picking in this environment? How are you thinking about it personally, and what would you tell CROs to be optimizing for in this unique environment?
Yeah, I think it's to our point in conversation here. It's tougher than it's been in a long time, because there's a long tail of others that may not be the right fit for you, and so you have to make sure that you're assessing that. Spend the time. Like, I think that's the really thing that I would highlight first. Get deep into team dynamic, financials. Like, I think that's the fun thing too, is like, don't be afraid to ask for those things. And I think be able to, kind of flex that muscle and really understand, what are the drivers of the business? What is the, kind of, cost structure? What are the investments being made in go to market? So like, how much investment are they making in, kind of sales and marketing? Are they making, zero investment and they want to hire you to reaccelerate growth? Like, that's red flag, red flags all over it there. But for me, I would say just my own personal frame, and then I'll, make it something others might be able to use. Like, you got to understand your stage fit. And, I've heard you actually talk about this, Kyle, but I think, for me early on in my career, I really, got a good sense for like where I thrive, where I have the most fun, where I have the biggest impact. And it's a certain kind of phase of company, right? And then, most folks associate it to, revenue, or I tend to associate it to revenue. And I would say like companies, under 10 million, there's a lot of folks who are really great in that zone. Like, that's a whole different world. Like, under 10 million, you don't have probably product market fit fully figured out yet, and it's not repeatable. And so, you need a leader who is going to be able to be high on experimentation and trying something every single day. For me, I would say like I am more of a scale up person. Like, I think that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that I take people through the awkward adolescence phase. That usually for me comes in around like 80 million. I think that's where I see a lot of the like big points of breakage. And, I just have a lot of pattern matching, and I would say a lot of, kind of process that I've implemented, in those times, or, how I've hired and thought about those structures and strategies. And so it's my comfort zone. So I'd say like for me, I start off with stage fit, like, is this the right size company? I really dig into financials, and, I think the big one too, also that you can't ignore is, what is their kind of like free cash burn rate? Like, how are they doing? Because I think that that is a question that needs to be asked. I think if companies, haven't been raising recently, like there might be a point of, kind of, high burn rate and, short runway. And so just understanding that piece. But I would say, that's one thing that I really want to dig in on. I want to understand like the challenges that they're facing, and, realize like, is this the stuff again that could be fixed with like the right process orientation, the right team, the right level of professionalization. Those are the things that I gear around. I would say like bonus points for me too is like, it has to be a product that I get excited about, which I think drives recruiters crazy, or folks that I'm talking to crazy. Because it's hard to quantify. But I would say like I am a very passion driven person, and I do feel like if I get my kind of head wrapped around something, like it consumes me morning, noon, night. And so the company that has that kind of unique combination, like it's going to be a great kind of winning formula. Whereas there's stuff that comes across my desk, it's perfect for someone else, but it's not me, and it's stuff that's just really, things that I don't get excited about. So anyways, that's kind of my, I would say like unique framework. I think, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about like, AI innovation. I think it's got to be a part of there too. Like, I think that, if they don't have, a structure or a story or at least a point of view, in the product, like, that would be, critical to me here, because it maybe means that they've kind of stagnated and they've lost their way, and probably, obviously aren't paying attention to the world right now. I think AI, only companies, like companies that were built in the last year or two, has caused me to actually look at smaller companies. Like, I don't hold hard and fast to 80 million. I think that I've talked to a lot of AI companies that, broke through 20 million last year and are on the path to get to 50 million, this year. And so you realize like they're just going through the growth, cycle that I'm thinking about and orienting around faster. And so, they may be seeing the problems of a company at 80 million that took, 7 years to get there. They're just going through it a lot faster. And so I think, I would say just make sure that you're scoring, with that in mind, and know that that's part of the story here.
Advice I've been giving recently, and I'd love your feedback on it, is I think people should be optimizing way more for company quality and way less on title and role and scope. Like, I think you're going back to this flight to quality opinion. I think you're much better off being a first line manager versus a second line, like quote unquote VP of sales at a mediocre company, especially if you need to like reaccelerate your career and put some shine back into the resume. Like, just go take the role at a best in class company and hitch your wagon to that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I love it, Kyle. I actually just was giving that same feedback like this past week. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it's, unfortunate because I maybe I've done it even parts of my career too. So like, I can't say that like I haven't, maybe gotten my priorities out of line or thought about it the wrong way. But, I talked to a number of folks who, started chasing career, kind of path and went after titles where it's like, it has to be this, it has to be a CRO, or it has to be, the VP of sales for North America, or else, I won't go, kind of thing. And they, if you over prioritize that, I would just say like what I found in my life too, like that and pay, sometimes, the folks that, give you those things aren't the best place to be. And, the company quality is probably pretty low. And so like you find yourself
the inverse correlation is very real there.
Yes. You find yourself really unhappy, making a lot of money. Look, and I think it's a double whammy too, because I have a lot of folks who've done this for a couple of, kind of hops now. And so they've gotten accustomed to a certain style of life and, living expenses. And so like, I get that too, where it's like, well, you got to probably readjust and recalibrate a little bit here. But, I think if you're always just saying, if they have to pay me this or else I won't join. It's like, okay, like have some flexibility right now. Because I think like every time that I've seen acceleration in my career, a lot of times it wasn't those things. It was like probably like a lateral move or taking a step, back or maybe sideways. I might have taken a little bit of a haircut in comp, but the company and the product and the mission were so solid that I was like, man, I'm having fun. And like, ironically, if you do it that way, titles come pretty quickly all of a sudden, pay actually starts to catch up to you because you're having a massive impact, right? And I think like that's the fun part of what you're doing, as you give that advice is, telling people to orient for the right things, means that you're setting yourself up for success there. I often even too, like a couple of times I've actually taken a step back joining a new company just because it gives you time to like ramp, build contextual knowledge, build trust, and then like, quickly jump to the spot you thought you deserved to be in or wanted to be in. But you do so with, a little bit of like, comfort, because it's familiar to you and you're coming in at the right, we'd say level of expectations to just exceed and clear them. And I think that's a good one too.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's get into rapid fire before we have to wrap up. I had like 7 more questions on this topic, but alas. What separates a good CRO from a great one in your mind?
Yeah, like that's a good one. And again, as I alluded to, it's changing and it's shifting. And I think, that's probably one of the things that I would say first off is like someone who's highly adaptable and is able to change, right? I think that that has to be part of, kind of your DNA. Someone who is like always learning too, because like the pace of change right now with like AI, like it's not coming like, it's not advancing weekly or monthly, it's daily. And I feel like someone who's able to, stay on top of these trends, be able to be adaptive to it. But look, I think a great people leader, like I think in these tough times, like those things you can work on and you can develop your chops around and you can pick up that orientation. But I would say, someone who can motivate folks, during these times, like I think is really unique. Like the folks that like people are like, I want to go work for Kyle, which I've actually heard this, but I'd say like, because, you're going to make them better because of it. You're going to, you guys are going to do something pretty incredible together. And I want to be a part of that mission. And I think like that is so powerful. And I think, it works for everybody, right? You want to give more for those leaders. You'll walk on, you'll walk across hot coals to make sure that things, kind of get done, and they'll do the same for you, right? You have that kind of mutual feeling, and that sort of thing is really important. And look, I think it stands out more so than ever right now too. Like I hear that a lot. Like I think, with all the things we talked about in adversity, again, it's, the ones that stand out are the ones that I hear repeatedly over and over again are the ones that are just great at motivating and tapping into the team.
Awesome. What's the most common advice you find yourself giving to young leaders? So like first time VPs of sales, first time with a big scope.
Yeah. I think it's always about like every time you go through these jumps, right? Like, to manager, director, then VP, like, you give away control, right? In some ways, because you're less hands-on, in those situations, like you're more distanced from the customer, than you've ever been. And so I think that causes some discomfort. So I would say like getting them to understand and embrace the discomfort and understand how to fly at that higher level now, but also be able to like drop in when you need to. And I think that comes down to how you set up the right systems and the right reporting, and like you understand how to use your talents effectively, right? Because, when you're a manager of 5-7 people, you could be on every call, you could be in every team meeting, right? And, when you have an organization of 60, 70, 100 plus folks, you can't. And so like, you have to start to think about that. You have to think about your team more so than ever, right? I think like you're cascading, your vision and what you expect out of people, and you're hoping that it gets carried, kind of three levels down. So you got to have a great team, and you have to have great, kind of trust there. And so I think like it's embracing those things as they're going through that, and then building the right systems to assess, those things quickly. And like, once you assess them, like build a plan to close the gaps as quick as possible there.
Awesome. What's the hardest lesson you've had to learn?
Man, I feel like I'm learning all the time, and I get a healthy dose of reality often here. Look, I think the hardest lesson maybe, more recently is about like, picking, I think this topic that you and I hit on, like picking the right team and environments, and how to maximize for the right things. I think like, even, at this stage and phase of my career, I've got it right a lot of times. And I think that's been because I picked the right product, the right team, and the right market opportunity, but you always miss something. And so I think every time, you go, through a good one and a bad one, like you learn things just like any other relationship, in your life. And so being able to like assess those things, really quickly. And, a big one that you get to see in the CRO seat is, sometimes the dysfunction of executive teams. And I think that one's a harder one to assess, Kyle. Because I think you can fall in love with the mission, you can fall in love with the product, you can even fall in love with like an inspirational CEO. But if your peers are a bunch of duds and they are like, not fun to work with and not holding up their end of the bargain or not challenging you and getting the best out of you and getting the best out of their team so that we're all successful, like that's a tricky one. And so I would say like making sure that you spend time on that layer, if you are, CRO, listen to this, like that was the big one for me, was like making sure to understand, like, how does the team, like, do they come together regularly to plan and, talk about, major themes in the business, are they, how do they challenge each other? If they have, conflict, how do they resolve it? I think those are all things that, you really want to assess and understand, like, is it a high functioning team or is it, a mediocre team? And I think getting it right is such a great thing when you nail it.
Yeah. Last question. What's the best thing you read in the last 12 months?
Man, I've got a bunch on my desk, as I say, so I'm trying to think through the ones that I've read most recently that I like. Look, I think actually, and this is, this month is Mental Health Month, so I think this is timely and important, but I think like I really geek out on human psychology. I really, think it's helpful as a, leader of teams to just understand that. But Wonder Boy, the story of Tony Assi, the founder of Zappos.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it dives deep into his story and scenario. So I won't spoil it, but I think like, Zappos was one of the most successful companies, of that era. He, was he could do no wrong and was unstoppable. And yet, he had his own things that he had to work through. Right. And so I think that's, important, as we lead teams and think about people's, kind of mental health, well-being, like, understanding that, high functioning, what we think are high functioning people could be, kind of dealing with things in their own right. And how do you be there for them and support them? It's so important.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. I love it. Well, John, this was great. I feel like I learned so much about building SLG and thinking about the foundations from like a very core level. And I got a whole whack load of notes. This was a blast. I appreciate you doing it.
Yeah, likewise, man. Always great to see you, Kyle. And yeah, I love the podcast. Like, you always have great folks on there. And so, happy to be a part of it. And I love the content. Keep it coming.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Revenue Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, and you can find a link in the show notes. And be sure to leave a 5-star review, share it with your network, and please join me next Wednesday for another great conversation.